Someone with Cooper's judgment issues might need a security escort off the premises. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 47 minutes before his entire world collapsed. Seattle General in San Diego hums with the familiar rhythm of night shift, fluorescent lights buzzing over linoleum floors polished to a dull shine, the antiseptic smell mixing with burned coffee from the nurse's station. It's 11:43 p.m. on a Tuesday. The ICU holds 8 patients. 7 are stable. One is the reason Ashley Cooper showed up tonight despite knowing exactly what waited for her in these hallways. She moves through the corridors with movements too precise for civilian training, her shoulders squared, her breathing controlled, her eyes tracking exits and sight lines the way people do when they've learned to survive in places where inattention gets you killed. No one notices. To Dr. Whitfield, she's just another nurse, one with a meticulous attention to detail that has nearly exposed his scheme of billing phantom procedures to Medicare, routing kickbacks through a shell company he established with 2 board members last year. To the residents, she's background noise. To the hospital, she's competent. To naval intelligence, she's an asset in an active operation that she cannot abandon, no matter how much she wants to walk out that door and never return. Her shift begins at 11 p.m. By 11:15, she's reviewed every chart in the ICU, checked every medication, verified every dose. Her hands move with the muscle memory of someone who has triaged casualties in field hospitals where mistakes meant body bags. The nurse's station smells like stale coffee and hand sanitizer. The monitors beep their steady rhythm, oxygen saturations climbing, heart rate stable, pressures holding. Normal. Routine. The kind of night shift where nothing happens except the paperwork. She finds the medication dispensary, enters her code, retrieves the morning doses for her patients. The pharmacy is quiet. Fluorescent overhead lights cast everything in the color of old bone. She logs each drug, each dose, noting the time to the minute: 7:23 a.m. furosemide, 8 a.m. metoprolol, 8 a.m. subcutaneous enoxaparin. Her charting is so detailed, so methodical, that it has become a liability. Last month, she documented a procedure Dr. Whitfield billed for, a peripheral artery catheterization, that never happened. She was in the room when it didn't happen. She noted it didn't happen. She charted it didn't happen. 3 days later, he mentioned her name in grand rounds. But that's not tonight. Tonight, the hallways are quiet. The code alarms are silent. The ventilators wheeze their mechanical rhythms in the rooms, and Ashley moves from bed to bed checking vitals, reviewing labs, ensuring that everyone under her care has what they need. She is efficient. She is thorough. She is invisible. By midnight, she reaches ICU bed 7. Marcus Chen lies in a hospital bed looking like a 24-year-old Navy SEAL who survived a training accident, which is exactly what the paperwork says happened. Rope training gone wrong on Camp Lejeune. Rope burn on both forearms. Concussion from the fall. Critical condition upgraded to stable after 24 hours of observation. The chart says Navy SEAL. It doesn't say classified technology. It doesn't say the Pentagon is very interested in what happened during his last mission, or whether he was compromised, or whether the people who compromised him need to be found before they sell what he knows to someone who'd pay for it. Ashley checks his full line. The catheter is well placed, the flow rate steady. She checks his core temperature, 98.1, stable. She checks his urine output, his oxygen saturation, his pupil response. Everything is normal. Everything is fine. Everything is exactly as it should be, which is the only reason she hasn't reported to her handler that something is very wrong. Marcus doesn't recognize her? Of course he doesn't. The last time she saw him, he was 4 years old and screaming, his parents bleeding out next to him in the rubble of a compound in Helmand Province, and she was covered in their blood, carrying him 8 miles across desert terrain while mortars fell around them like thunder. 20 years ago. He was too young to remember faces. Too young to understand what happened. Too young to know that the woman who carried him, who wouldn't set him down even when her commander ordered her to evacuate, was a Master Chief Petty Officer serving in a capacity that didn't officially exist in a conflict that the government still hasn't acknowledged. His medical file says his parents were contractors killed in an accident. The accident part is true. The contractors part is technically accurate. They worked for a private security company that contracted with the State Department, which means the government was legally absolved of any responsibility for what happened to them or their child. Ashley doesn't dwell on this. Dwelling is a luxury she surrendered along with her dress blues and her real name, the one almost no one still uses. She checks his medications, ensures his monitor leads are secure, documents everything with the precision of someone who knows that attention to detail can preserve a life or end a career. She steps out of his room at 12:44 a.m. and heads toward the break room. The hallway stretches before her, fluorescent and endless, lined with the closed doors of sleeping patients. The only sounds are the distant whir of the fax system and, from somewhere deeper in the hospital, the rhythmic beep of a monitor she's learned to tune out. That's when she hears the laughter. Two physicians stand near the vending machines, residents, younger, probably post-call and punchy from lack of sleep. One of them is Dr. Whitfield. He's wearing the same tailored shirt he wore during grand rounds yesterday, the one that cost more than Ashley's monthly car payment, and his phone is in his hand, lit up with something that made him smile. The problem with hiring based on competence, he's saying to the other resident, a younger man with tired eyes and scrubs that actually fit, is that you occasionally get people who think they can actually practice medicine. Judgment calls. Evidence-based interventions. It's adorable, really. The other resident doesn't respond. He's studying the vending machine with the intensity of someone hoping the snacks will become more interesting if he stares long enough. I'm genuinely concerned about someone like Cooper, Whitfield continues, and Ashley's stride doesn't change, her breathing doesn't change, her face doesn't show a thing because she learned a very long time ago that showing weakness is how predators know you're worth hunting. That kind of judgment issue? Someone with her particular set of assumptions about protocol? I think she might need a security escort off the premises. For everyone's safety, of course. The younger resident glances toward the hallway where Ashley walks past them, her badge clipped to her scrubs, her stethoscope coiled in her pocket, her hand steady as she moves toward the break room. She doesn't break stride. She doesn't look at either of them. She doesn't acknowledge that she heard every word, that she catalogued the dismissal in his voice and the way it landed like a physical blow in a place where bruises don't show on X-rays. The break room is empty at this hour. The fluorescent lights hum overhead. The microwave sits on the counter next to a refrigerator that smells faintly of old lunch containers and institutional regret. Ashley pours herself a cup of black coffee from the pot that's been brewing since shift change, and she drinks it standing at the window that overlooks the parking lot. It's raining. Not hard, just the kind of steady San Diego rain that falls maybe 3 times a year and makes everyone act surprised, as if weather is a personal betrayal. What they didn't know was that the woman standing in that break room had survived 7 direct action raids in hostile territory. Had extracted intelligence from people trained to resist interrogation. Had carried wounded Marines across terrain that wanted to kill them. Had done things in service to her country that she would never mention in a job interview, that she would never discuss at a dinner party, that she would take to her grave because some secrets are bigger than the people who hold them. What they didn't know was that Whitfield's concern about her judgment was the least threatening thing she'd faced in 24 hours. She finishes her coffee and sets the cup in the sink, and that's when the second shoe drops. Her phone vibrates. Secure line. Handler's protocol. She doesn't look at it here, not where the cameras can see her reaching for it too quickly, not where the timing might suggest something other than a routine night shift. Instead, she walks back to the ICU, returns to Marcus Chen's room, and checks his medications one more time. His oxygen saturation is 94% on 2 liters nasal cannula. His heart rate is 68, regular. His breathing is easy. He's healing. He's recovering. He's stable, which is more than can be said for the situation she's embedded in, the one where her direct supervisor just suggested she needed security to escort her off the premises, the one where her meticulous charting had documented every fraudulent billing code that Dr. Whitfield had attempted to hide. She returns to the break room at 1:15 a.m. and finally checks her phone. The message is simple. Direct. It comes through an encrypted channel that officially doesn't exist, Asset Chen security status compromised. Remain embedded. Monitor for exfiltration attempts. Handler will contact 0800. Ashley reads it once. Then she deletes it. Then she sits in the break room of Seattle General in San Diego and drinks another cup of black coffee while the rain hammers the windows like applause, and she waits for something she can't see coming, something her years of training have prepared her for, but nothing could really prepare a person for the moment when your cover and your mission are operating in direct conflict, and staying hidden means watching someone else destroy everything you've worked to preserve. She returns to her locker at 1:53 a.m., ostensibly to retrieve her stethoscope scope for a patient check. The locker is narrow, standard issue, the kind that every hospital employee gets regardless of rank or tenure. On the top shelf are her street clothes, folded neatly. On the second shelf are her personal items, a photograph she shouldn't keep but can't bring herself to destroy, a change of socks, a hand cream that keeps the hospital antiseptic from drying out her skin. On the bottom, beneath her civilian coat, are her combat boots. The leather is cracked from 20 years of wear. The laces are frayed. The soles are stained with sand that no amount of washing will remove because some stains are part of the material itself. These boots have crossed deserts. They have carried her through firefights. They have walked past the bodies of Marines and contractors and one 4-year-old boy she pulled out of the rubble of a compound that no longer exists, in a province that the government still officially denies any significant presence in. She doesn't remove them. She just looks at them, this physical proof that everything else in her life is a cover story. Master Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy. 20 years of service. 3 tours of Helmand Province. 2 in Yemen. 1 in an operation that she will never be able to discuss or confirm or acknowledge to anyone except in the kind of debriefing rooms that are classified to the point where the building itself is technically a secret. And now she's a nurse at Seattle General in San Diego, charting medications and documenting procedures, watching a man who doesn't know her carry a secret he doesn't understand, waiting for the moment when everything collapses. She closes the locker quietly at 1:52 a.m. The night shift continues. The monitors beep. The ventilators whoosh. The rain continues its steady percussion against the windows. Ashley returns to her patients, to her charts, to the methodical work of keeping people alive while her real mission quietly falls apart around her. The truth about who she is remains hidden. The truth about what Dr. Whitfield is doing remains documented in her charting. The truth about Marcus Chen's compromised security status remains classified. But not for long. Thursday grand rounds filled the conference room with 23 residents and for attending physicians, the fluorescent lights humming their relentless mechanical prayer above mahogany tables and open laptops displaying patient charts. Dr. Whitfield stood at the head of the room, his tailored suit pressing sharp creases into the morning light, and he smiled the way predators do when they've chosen their prey. Ashley stood motionless near the window, her name already written on the whiteboard beside a patient's chart, not as a hero, but as a cautionary tale. Can anyone explain why Nurse Cooper ordered these redundant labs on the SEAL patient? Whitfield's voice carried the weight of authority, each word a stone dropped into still water. The residents shifted in their seats, uncertain, waiting for the trap to spring. This is how hospitals hemorrhage money. When staff don't understand basic protocols, when someone thinks they know better than the physicians ordering care. He turned slightly, just enough to let his gaze graze her face. Basic labs, people. That's all they needed. Not this. He tapped the chart with his pen, a gesture meant to land like a gavel. Ashley's jaw clenched once. Just once. Her pen remained steady in her hand, her posture unchanged, her breathing the same measured rhythm it had been all morning. She did not look at him. She did not defend herself. She did not flinch. The silence in the room became the loudest thing present, residents watching her the way people watch car accident videos, uncomfortable, unable to look away, searching for the moment when someone breaks. That moment did not come. Dr. Patel, a senior attending, whispered something to the resident beside her, but Ashley's eyes stayed fixed on the patient monitor visible through the conference room glass, watching the rhythms of lives that depended on precision, not ego. The meeting continued for another 40 minutes. Whitfield moved through cases with the precision of someone long practiced at domination, and Ashley remained standing, because there was nowhere to sit, because sitting would have meant accepting a position of vulnerability. Her hands, the ones that had once held combat tourniquets in 100-degree heat, the ones that had carried a bleeding 4-year-old through 2 miles of Helmand Province desert, remained folded at her waist. The trembling wasn't fear. The trembling wasn't there at all. What lived beneath her skin was restraint, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what you're capable of and choosing, moment after moment, not to unleash it. When the meeting ended, residents filed past her with eyes averted, uncomfortable with the anatomy of bullying they'd just witnessed. One of them, a woman named Torres, paused near Ashley's shoulder and said quietly, "That wasn't fair." Ashley replied, "No. It wasn't," her voice carrying no bitterness, no self-pity, just the flat acknowledgement of fact. She checked her watch, 0832 hours, and turned toward the ICU corridor. The third-floor vending machine sat at the intersection of 2 hallways, a junction point where the hospital's social hierarchies were casually reinforced. Dr. Whitfield arrived there at 11:47 hours with Drive Marcus Hayes, a cardiologist whose family name carried the kind of old money weight that opened doors in San Diego country clubs. They didn't notice Ashley approaching from the opposite direction, moving toward Chen's room with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned that invisibility was a tactical advantage. Whitfield's voice reached her first, the tone of a man conducting business among friends. "Between you and me, the board's already reviewing her file," Whitfield said, his laugh cutting through the fluorescent hum. "Someone with Cooper's judgment issues, we can't afford that kind of liability. I'm documenting everything." He inserted the nickname like a blade, letting it settle in the air between them. "Clipboard Cooper. Thinks she's smarter than protocols. Thinks she can second-guess physician orders." Hayes laughed, the sound thin and practiced. "Security escort might be the kindest exit we could offer her." Ashley walked past them without breaking stride. Her shoulders didn't tense. Her pace didn't accelerate. She moved through the space between them the way currents of water move around rocks, constant, purposeful, utterly unmoved by their presence. Neither man acknowledged her passage. She was already forgotten, a problem in the process of being solved, a situation being managed by people with the institutional power to make such things happen. She continued to Chen's room, where the monitors showed steady cardiac rhythm, where the 24-year-old SEAL lay sleeping under sedation, unaware that the woman checking his vitals had pulled him from the rubble of a compound in Helmand Province 20 years ago when he was small enough to carry. That afternoon, Whitfield's office door closed with the soft precision of a trap springing. Ashley sat across from his desk, her posture perfect, her hands folded in her lap, the image of a submissive employee awaiting judgment. Whitfield pulled a manila folder from his desk drawer, the gesture theatrical, designed for maximum impact. "Your performance review shows a pattern of insubordination and clinical errors," he said, his voice measured, confident, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I'm recommending immediate termination to the board. Effective immediately." He opened the folder, showing her pages of documentation, medication errors she had never made, lab orders he had reinterpreted, timestamps altered just enough to create the appearance of negligence. The work of someone meticulous, someone who understood that documentation was the foundation of institutional power. Ashley folded her hands tighter in her lap and said, "Understood, doctor," her voice flat, professional, offering him nothing, no anger, no tears, no begging, no emotional response whatsoever. He expected something. The absence of it enraged him further, his jaw tightening as he realized that his words had landed on someone impervious to their weight. He expected vulnerability. What he found was absence, a void where his attacks should have echoed. That silence, that perfect composure, would stay with him. It would be the reason he would make the next 3 phone calls before the day ended. The first call went to Board Chairman Morrison at 1603 hours, a conversation conducted in the careful language of mutual obligation. Morrison's son had received a DUI last spring, and Whitfield had quietly ensured the arrest record disappeared, the blood tests misfiled, the video evidence of impaired driving somehow misplaced in the evidence system. Loyalty demanded reciprocation. "We have a nurse creating liability issues," Whitfield said, his voice suggesting concern for institutional welfare rather than personal vendetta. Cooper. ICU staff. "I need the board to move quickly on termination. She's dangerous. Incompetent. I have documentation." The documentation he had created 43 minutes prior, printed and signed with Morrison's name in CSIT emails to the State Nursing Board, to her VA references who knew only her cover story as a former combat medic with sealed records, to an outside investigator he paid $800 to audit her last 6 months of charting for patterns of negligence. By 1847 hours, the machinery had begun its work. By 1952 hours, Ashley had received a letter from the State Nursing Board requesting her response to allegations of medication errors, falsified records, and clinical negligence. The letter was professional, bureaucratic, the product of a system designed to protect patients but easily weaponized by those who understood how to speak its language. She drove home in silence, her hand steady on the wheel, her breathing unchanged. She did not call a lawyer. She did not call her handler. She did not tell anyone. When she arrived at the house she shared with her 16-year-old son Jake, she said nothing about any of it. She microwaved dinner in silence, sat at the kitchen table in silence, and helped Jake with his calculus homework in silence, the kind of presence that requires no explanation, the kind of strength that exists in what is left unsaid. At 03 for 7 hours Friday morning, the code alarm shattered the ICU silence like glass breaking in a cathedral. Marcus Chen's monitors screamed their urgency, the familiar language of crisis, the syntax of bodies failing. Cardiac arrest. Asystole. Death announcing itself in electrical signals and vanishing waveforms. Ashley was first to the bed, her feet moving before conscious thought could intervene, muscle memory taking over with the precision of someone who had lived in this moment before, in compounds and forward operating bases and field hospitals smelling of copper and diesel exhaust. Her hands already knew what to do. The surgical resident arrived trembling, his fingers shaking as he prepared the tray for emergency thoracotomy, the blade that would crack open Chen's chest and expose the machinery of his heart to direct manipulation. "We need to crack the chest," Ashley said, her voice dropping an octave, no longer seeking permission but issuing command. The attending surgeon glanced at her twice, something shifting in his expression, recognition, perhaps, of competence that transcended rank. Chen's blood pressure dropped to 40/20. The monitors displayed the digital version of drowning. The resident's hands froze, unable to make the incision, frozen in the moment between knowledge and action. Ashley moved past him with the fluid precision of apex predators, her hands already inside Chen's thoracic cavity, performing direct cardiac massage, palming his heart like it was something precious and fragile, something worth saving through sheer force of will and muscle memory forged in 1,000 trauma scenarios. Epi pushed 4. 2 units O-negative running wide open. Pressure bag squeezing blood into his veins like a second heartbeat. "Charge to 200, she said, and the defibrillator pads went on, and the electricity jolted through him, and the monitors beeped once, twice, and then, sinus rhythm. His heart restarted. Pressure climbing. Oxygen saturation rising. 78. 85. 92. Stable. For minutes. That's all it took. The attending surgeon stared at her, asking, "Where did you learn to do that?" Ashley stripped off her gloves with the same precision she'd used to save Chen's life, replied, "Training," and walked to the sink. But the night shift supervisor was already texting Whitfield, fingers moving across her phone screen, "Your problem nurse just saved the SEAL with battlefield trauma surgery." And Whitfield, reading that message at 0401 hours, knowing his termination recommendation would now appear retaliatory rather than protective, made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career. He decided to accelerate everything. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It changed everything. The code alarm shattered the night at 03 for 7 hours. 3 short bursts, then continuous. Marcus Chen's monitors screaming what his body was already saying. Flat line. The surgical resident, a kid no older than 26, went white. His hands froze mid-chart. Around him, nurses moved in practiced chaos, but that freezing moment, that split second of paralysis, was everything. That was the moment incompetence became dangerous. Ashley heard it from the break room. She didn't run. Running draws attention. She walked. Her scrubs were already in her locker. She moved through the ICU doors at 0348, and the scene registered in the way combat experience teaches you to see: vitals, positioning, threat assessment. Chen's chest was already open. The resident had finally moved, had finally done something. The attending surgeon was there, calling out compressions, but his voice carried the tone of someone reading instructions he wasn't sure applied. Muscle memory in the room was missing. Direction was absent. Someone needed to take the weight. "Step back," Ashley said. Not a question. Not polite. The attending surgeon blinked. His hands were on Chen's ribs. "I said step back." It wasn't a request. It was a command. The surgeon moved. He didn't understand why his body obeyed, but something in her voice, something that transcended hospital hierarchy, that predated his title entirely, made him step away from the open chest cavity. Ashley's hands were steady as a surgical laser. The direct cardiac massage required access through the sternum, and the resident had done the hard work of opening. What Ashley did next was something only hands that had held lives together in desert compounds could accomplish. She placed her palm directly against Chen's myocardium. She could feel it in her fingertips, the useless quivering of a heart in arrest. Ventricular fibrillation. The rhythm of death. "Charge the paddles." 200 joules, Ashley said. Her voice was flat. Clinical. The resident scrambled for the defibrillator. Around the bed, every nurse in the ICU had stopped moving. Not frozen, something different. They were watching. They were seeing something they'd only read about in textbooks. The paddles made contact. The voltage hit Chen's chest, and his body convulsed against the table. Ashley's hands were already moving again, back to his chest, fingers finding the ventricle, beginning the compressions that a machine could never replicate. Push. Release. Push. Release. Her compressions carried the precision of someone who'd done this on a sand floor under incoming fire, with no morphine and no next unit coming. Pain was information. Pressure was data. O2 sat, she asked without looking up. 68 and dropping, the respiratory therapist answered. Push 1 milligram epi. Now. The needle went in. Ashley felt the medication hit the bloodstream, could sense the cascade of chemistry that might kickstart a heart that had forgotten how to beat. Her eyes never left Chen's chest. Her compressions never faltered. In the years between Helmand Province and Seattle General, she'd learned 1,000 ways to be invisible. In this moment, invisibility was impossible. In this moment, a Master Chief Petty Officer was standing in an ICU at 0350 hours, hands on a Navy SEAL's heart, pulling him back from the edge of whatever comes after. Again. Charge 200, Ashley said. The paddles. The voltage. The convulsion. The compressions returned. 30 seconds of perfect rhythm. Her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had already survived the worst that combat could offer. Around the room, the resident was taking notes. The attending surgeon was watching her hand placement with the intensity of a man realizing he'd just watched someone operate at a level he would never reach. The ICU nurses had stopped pretending to work. They were staring. Rhythm check, Ashley called. The cardiac monitor beeped. Once. Twice. Then a pause. Then 3 beats, strong and distinct, the sound of a heart remembering how to work. Sinus rhythm. A Navy SEAL's heart, brought back from flatline by someone he had no idea had carried him through a desert when he was 4 years old and bleeding from shrapnel wounds that should have killed him. 92 and climbing, someone said. O2 sat rising. 82. 90. The numbers climbing like a man pulling himself out of a pit. By 0354, Chen's vitals had stabilized enough that he could be moved to recovery. By 03:56, the crisis was over. Ashley stepped back from the table. She was breathing normally. Her scrubs weren't even damp. The attending surgeon was trying to make eye contact. The resident was still writing something down, his hands shaking in a way hers absolutely were not. She removed her gloves and disposed of them in the red bin, and then she walked out of the ICU without saying a word. That was the moment everything changed. That was the moment when a nurse named Ashley Cooper became something that couldn't be unwitnessed. But Whitfield was already making calls. At 04:05, while Chen was still in recovery and Ashley was washing her hands in the break room sink, Whitfield was in his office with the door closed, his phone warm against his ear. He'd listened to the code alarm broadcast on the hospital intercom. He'd heard the response, heard the controlled voice, Ashley's voice, taking charge of a situation that should have killed a Navy SEAL. He'd heard the other voices stepping back. He'd heard the respect that comes when competence becomes undeniable. Which meant he had to move fast. His first call was to the board chairman, Michael Hastings, a man who'd owed Whitfield a favor since Whitfield had discreetly helped his son avoid a DUI arrest by having the police report mysteriously misfiled. Whitfield didn't bother with pleasantries. "We have a problem. Nurse Cooper performed unauthorized procedures on a patient tonight. Reckless cowboy medicine. Open chest compression without proper protocol authorization. We're looking at massive liability exposure." Hastings listened. Whitfield could hear the fear in the silence. "I'll handle it," Whitfield continued. "But I need you to document this as a compliance violation, effective immediately. I'm bringing in an outside investigator." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of power in motion, a series of dominoes already falling. His second call was to Dr. Patricia Reeves at the VA Medical Center where Ashley's background check had been run. Reeves had been one of Ashley's supervisors years ago, though the records were sparse. Whitfield had prepared his approach carefully. "Patricia, I'm calling about one of your former employees, Ashley Cooper. She's working with us now, and I've become concerned about some behavioral patterns. Boundary issues with military patients. Erratic decision-making under pressure. I wanted to reach out professionally, see if you'd noticed anything similar during her tenure." Reeves was careful. She didn't gossip. But she also knew that Whitfield was the chief of surgery at a major hospital, and in the hierarchy of institutional power, chiefs of surgery rarely called with gossip. They called with legitimate concerns. "I don't recall any specific incidents," Reeves said slowly. "But it was a long time ago. What I'm asking is whether you'd be surprised if such patterns emerge now," Whitfield said. He was good at this. He'd spent 20 years weaponizing professionalism. "Would that fit with what you remember?" Reeves thought about it. She thought about a woman she'd known for maybe 6 months, years ago, a woman whose personnel file was minimal and whose references seemed thin. "I wouldn't say I knew her well enough to rule it out," Reeves finally answered. Whitfield smiled. "Thank you, Patricia. That's all I needed to know." By 04:20, Whitfield had contacted the outside investigator, a former compliance officer named Robert Chen, no relation to the patient, and instructed him to prioritize Ashley's chart reviews from the last 6 months. Look for patterns of negligence, unauthorized procedures, anything that suggests a cavalier approach to protocol. Cast a wide net. At 04:45, Whitfield visited Marcus Chen's recovery room. The SEAL was groggy, still sedated from the trauma, but his eyes tracked Whitfield as the surgeon pulled a chair close to the bed. "You're doing well, Marcus." "Very well. But I want to be transparent about what happened in the OR. The protocols we follow exist to protect you. Last night, Nurse Cooper performed a procedure, direct cardiac massage without proper surgical oversight, that violated those protocols. You survived despite her intervention, not because of it. You understand?" Chen, sedated and confused, nodded slowly. He didn't understand. He wouldn't understand for some time. But the seed was planted. Doubt had been introduced into the relationship between a Navy SEAL and the woman who'd just saved his life. At 0530, Ashley was in the break room, changing out of her scrubs for the shift change. Her hands were still steady. Her breathing was still even. But there was something different in the quality of the quiet around her. The other nurses were being careful not to make eye contact. The attending surgeon had vanished. The resident was speaking in hushed tones to someone on his phone. Whitfield appeared at the break room entrance at 0545, and he wasn't alone. A woman in a hospital security jacket stood beside him. "Ashley," Whitfield said, and his voice carried the false sympathy of a predator who knew he had you cornered. "I need to inform you that effective immediately, you're suspended pending investigation. There are concerns about protocol violations from last night. You're not to contact the patient. You're not to access hospital systems. Security will escort you out at 0600. Ashley looked at him. She didn't blink. She didn't speak. She just nodded once, and that small movement contained more controlled fury than Whitfield had ever seen in a human face. For just a moment, he felt something in the air pressure change. For just a moment, he wondered if he'd made a mistake. Then the moment passed, and he left. Ashley finished changing. She hung her stethoscope in her locker, the one she'd carried through 100 night shifts, 100 patient crises, 100 moments of being invisible. She placed it in a plastic bag with something else, something she kept hidden at the bottom of her locker under her civilian coat. A pair of worn combat boots, the leather cracked from desert sun, the laces stiff with sand that had never quite washed away. Those boots had crossed 700 miles of hostile terrain. They'd felt the ground shake under mortar fire. They'd walked through a compound in Helmand province and carried a 4-year-old boy who had no idea his rescuer would spend the next 20 years watching over him from a hospital floor. She held the boots for a moment, just long enough for her hands to start shaking. But she did it alone. She did it behind the locker door where no one could see. In public, in front of the security officer and the fluorescent lights and the institutional machinery that had decided her competence was a liability, Ashley Cooper remained perfectly composed. She folded her scrubs precisely, creasing each sleeve with the muscle memory of someone who understood how to treat fabric with the same respect you'd treat a flag. Then she carried everything, the plastic bag with the boots, the bag with the scrubs, toward the laundry room at 0558. Hospital policy didn't require staff to personally deliver their uniforms. But she did it anyway. Some rituals matter when everything else is being taken away. She was halfway across the parking lot, the San Diego dawn just beginning to crack the sky, when she heard footsteps sprinting behind her. By 6 in the morning, Dr. Whitfield had made 7 calls. 7. The hospital's outside investigator arrived at 6:53 a.m. with a leather briefcase and the kind of smile that meant documentation. The board chairman sat in the administrator's office while Whitfield paced, phone still warm in his hand, explaining how Nurse Cooper's charting showed a concerning pattern of redundant orders, questionable judgment calls, medication administration inconsistencies. "It's all there," he said. Meticulous documentation of her own negligence. The investigator opened his briefcase and began pulling files. Whitfield watched from his office window as the San Diego sun cracked the horizon orange and gold, indifferent to what was about to happen to a woman who'd saved a man's life 4 hours earlier. The hospital attorney used the word accumulated 3 times. Accumulated performance concerns. Accumulated judgment issues. Accumulated evidence of a pattern that suggested Nurse Cooper was no longer suitable for patient care. Ashley sat in a conference room on the 4th floor, her hands folded on the table in front of her, her jaw clenched so tight a vein showed at her temple, but her eyes were flat and empty as a closed door. The attorney didn't look at her while he spoke. None of them did. Whitfield watched from the hallway through the conference room's glass wall, arms crossed, that small satisfied smile playing at the corners of his mouth, the expression of a man who'd just removed a problem from his institution. Effective immediately, the attorney said. Security will escort you to collect your personal items. You'll have 15 minutes. Ashley didn't speak. She stood. Her chair didn't scrape against the floor because she pushed it in carefully, deliberately, the way she'd been taught to move in compounds where sound carried like a warning. The walk to the employee locker room took her through the ICU corridor. She didn't look left or right. She didn't look at the open door of Marcus Chen's room where he slept, chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of a man who would live because of her hands, not despite her termination. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a sound she'd heard 10,000 times, and now it sounded like a countdown. The locker room smelled like stale coffee and the particular chemical scent of industrial disinfectant that never quite faded from the walls. Ashley opened her locker, compartment 247, third row, and began removing the things that marked her as belonging here. Stethoscope, coiled like a snake. 2 granola bars she'd never eaten. The handwritten note Jake had left her 3 months ago, folded small enough to fit in a pocket. She'd kept it in this locker, a small piece of her actual life hidden among the artifacts of her cover. She held it for 3 seconds, then placed it back on the shelf. Some things couldn't come with her yet. The scrubs came next. She peeled them off in the empty locker room, 081 for hours, no one else present, and folded them with the precision of someone who'd been taught to fold military dress uniforms, to fold flags, to fold grief into geometric shapes. Each sleeve creased sharp enough to cut. The chest folded inward. The pants folded lengthwise. When she finished, the scrubs formed a perfect rectangle, and she placed them in the hospital laundry bin herself, her hands moving through the motions of a ritual that mattered because rituals were what held people together when everything else was being dismantled. The combat boots came from the bottom of her locker, worn and weathered, the leather cracked in patterns that mapped 19 years of missions, Helmand Province, Kandahar, 3 tours that never made the news. She placed them in a plastic bag with her stethoscope, the only 2 items that actually belonged to her. Ashley closed the locker door and did not look back at the empty compartment. She was halfway across the parking lot, the San Diego dawn just beginning to crack the sky orange and vulnerable, when she heard the footsteps. Running. Fast. She turned and saw her son, Jake, 16 years old, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders, sprinting across the asphalt toward her with the desperation of someone who'd just realized what was happening. He was shouting something, but the distance swallowed his words until he was closer, until she could hear him gasping, "Mom, stop, you can't just leave." Ashley saw what he was carrying before he reached her. A shadow box. Her shadow box. The one that lived in the back corner of their garage, behind the Christmas decorations and the boxes of photos she couldn't look at. Inside the glass frame were the medals, Bronze Star, Silver Star, 2 Purple Hearts, and the Navy Cross, the insignia of the Master Chief Petty Officer gleaming in the rising sun like an accusation. "Put those away," Ashley said. Her voice had dropped an octave without her permission. Not a request. A command. "Jake, you don't understand what you're doing." "I understand exactly," Jake said, breathing hard, his face flushed with rage and something that looked like terror. "They're firing you. They're calling you incompetent. And you're just going to walk away and let them win. That's how this works. That's how giving up works." Ashley reached for the shadow box, but Jake spun away from her, not running, but walking fast toward the hospital entrance, toward the administrative building, his jaw set in a way that was hers, that was her own stubbornness pressed into a teenager's face. "No," he said. "No way. They need to know who you are." "Jake!" He was moving through the entrance doors before she could finish. She followed him up the stairs, 2 flights, the stairwell echoing with footsteps, and through the administrative corridor to the second-floor conference room where she could see through the glass walls that Whitfield was inside, seated at a mahogany table with the board chairman and an investigator she didn't recognize. And someone else. A man in dress blues with the insignia of a 2-star general, his shoulder boards catching the fluorescent light. A Navy officer. Not from her chain of command. Someone visiting. Someone who had no idea what was about to walk through those conference room doors. Jake burst in without knocking. The sound of the door hitting the wall echoed through the hallway like a gunshot. "They need to see these," Jake shouted, slamming the shadow box onto the mahogany table. The glass frame struck the wood with a sharp crack. My mom saved that seal's life and you're firing her. And nobody even knows, nobody even. The room went silent. The kind of silence that comes right before everything changes. The Navy SEAL liaison officer who'd been standing in the corner of the conference room went rigid, his eyes fixed on the shadow box, on the insignia, on the medals visible through the glass. "Phantom," he said quietly. So quietly Ashley almost didn't hear it through the open door. "Is that call sign Phantom?" The hospital's security guard, a Marine veteran named Holloway, stood from his chair beside the door. His face had gone pale. His voice climbed with each word. "That's a Master Chief Petty Officer's insignia, sir, 3 Navy Crosses." He was looking at Whitfield while he spoke, and the expression on his face was the expression of someone who'd just realized he'd been watching a legend fold scrubs in silence. The 2-star general rose from his seat and moved toward the shadow box with the kind of deliberate motion that came from 3 decades of command. He picked up the frame carefully, reverently, and began to read the citations inscribed on the medals. His voice filled the room, precise, formal, the voice of someone who knew how to speak to history. Master Chief Ashley Cooper. For extraordinary valor in Helmand Province during a compound rescue under sustained enemy fire, resulting in the extraction of 14 civilians including 4 children, 3 of whom were under 5 years old. For tactical field amputation and emergency surgical intervention in Kandahar Province, preventing exsanguination in 7 operators and preserving combat capability. For a classified hostage extraction in Yemen resulting in 0 friendly casualties and the recovery of 3 U.S. intelligence assets. 4. The general paused, reading silently for a moment, then looked up at Ashley standing in the doorway. His eyes moved across her face like he was reading something written in a language only military personnel understood. For 23 years of continuous service with 0 commendations denied. For 47 confirmed lives saved across 3 combat zones. For, he stopped, because the door to the conference room opened again and Marcus Chen appeared in a wheelchair, pushed by a night shift nurse, his forepaw rattling as the wheels hit the door frame. Chen looked like he'd climbed out of a hospital bed an hour before his body was ready. The surgical staples along his chest showed through his open gown. His color was gray, but his eyes were awake and focused. He rolled himself forward until he was inside the conference room, and the nurse stepped back, understanding that what was about to happen needed space. "She carried me 8 miles, Chen said. His voice was hoarse, ravaged by the intubation tube. "I was 4 years old. My parents were DoD contractors killed in a mortar attack on their compound. All of us were there, 5 contractors, their families. The rotor wash from the incoming Black Hawk brought the next volley down on top of us. She ran through the secondary impact zone to get the other kids, and when the LZ became too hot, when her commander ordered her to evacuate, she wrapped me in a poncho liner and ran. 8 miles through Helmand Province with a 4-year-old in her arms and a rifle she couldn't use because both hands were holding me." The silence lasted 10 full seconds. Ashley could hear the monitor beeping in Chen's room down the hallway, the ventilator wheeze of another patient, the distant sound of a helicopter rotor starting up on the helipad, the one that always sounded like distant thunder rolling toward a decision. Whitfield's face had drained of color entirely. His mouth opened and closed without sound. The board chairman was already standing, already reaching for his phone, because the man knew what he was looking at. The investigator set down his folder and cleared his throat. "I need to report on my audit findings," the investigator said quietly. "I found significant irregularities in this hospital's billing records. However, they're not in Nurse Cooper's documentation. They're in Dr. Whitfield's surgical codes. Phantom procedures. Inflated surgical times. Kickbacks routed through a shell company established with 2 board members. The documentation I found in Nurse Cooper's meticulous charting provided a prosecutorial quality evidence trail documenting $2.3 million in fraudulent Medicare billing over the past 18 months. The 2-star general turned to Whitfield very slowly. "Doctor, I think you should leave this meeting." Whitfield stood, his chair scraping backward, his mouth opening as if he might speak, might argue, might defend himself, and then he simply left. The door closed behind him with a soft click, final as a casket lid. The SEAL liaison officer approached Ashley, his movements formal and respectful. "Master Chief, I need to inform you that the Secretary of the Navy has requested your presence at a ceremony in Washington. 3 hours from now. Your Medal of Freedom nomination cleared congressional review this morning. The President would like to meet the operator who saved 47 lives across 3 decades of service." Ashley's composure finally cracked. Just for a moment. Her eyes widened, barely perceptible, a quarter-inch expansion of her pupils, and then she controlled it, pulling the mask back down with the discipline of someone who'd been trained to control everything. Jake was crying openly. Chen, still in his wheelchair, still hooked to and fore, raised his hand to his forehead in a salute, weak, but deliberate, honoring something he'd only just learned he was looking at. Jake was crying openly. Chen, still in his wheelchair, still hooked to and fore, raised his hand to his forehead in a salute, weak, but deliberate, honoring something he'd only just learned he was looking at. The shadow box sat on the mahogany conference table like a detonation device, and the room had gone so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights humming their mechanical dirge above the board members' heads. The Navy SEAL officer who'd been touring the military liaison program stood first, his chair scraping backward with a sound like a rifle bolt chambering. His eyes locked on the insignia, 3 gold chevrons with anchor and trident, and his voice came out steady but loaded with something between recognition and awe. "Phantom," he said. It wasn't a question. "Is that call sign Phantom?" The room went dead silent. Nobody moved. Ashley stood in the doorway, still wearing her civilian jacket, still holding that plastic bag with her stethoscope and folded scrubs. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The silence itself was the confirmation, and every person in that room could feel it settling like pressure before a storm. The Marine security guard who'd walked her to her locker room 3 hours earlier, the same one Whitfield had threatened to assign to escort her off the premises, went rigid. His hand went to his chest in an instinctive gesture, like something in his body was responding to rank and heritage before his mind caught up. "That's a Master Chief Petty Officer's insignia, sir," he said, his voice climbing with each word. 3 Navy crosses. "Sir." A 2-star general in dress uniform, he'd been observing the hospital's military liaison program, a visiting dignitary nobody had paid much attention to until this moment, picked up the shadow box with both hands like it was a religious artifact. His eyes moved across the citations printed below each medal, and when he started reading aloud, the words filled the room with the weight of history and blood and desert sand that no conference room had ever been designed to hold. Helmand Province, 2003. Battlefield extraction under sustained mortar fire. 19 personnel evacuated. 2 medical personnel wounded during operation. Citation commended for extraordinary valor under fire. He paused. His eyes moved to the next line. Kandahar, 2006. Hostage rescue operation, Alpha Company compound. 12 hostages recovered. 3 Taliban fighters neutralized. Medic sustained shrapnel wound, continued operations for additional 72 minutes before evacuation. Another pause. A longer one. And here, a Yemen operation, classified designation. Citation redacted per national security protocols. Medal of Freedom nomination pending congressional review. The board chairman's face had gone the color of old institutional paint. The outside investigator who Whitfield had hired, the one meant to bury Ashley under documentation, cleared his throat. It was a small sound, barely audible, but it carried the weight of someone watching his entire professional purpose collapse in real time. "Excuse me," the investigator said. His pen was in his hand, but it was shaking. "My audit. The one you asked me to conduct on Nurse Cooper's charting." He looked at Whitfield, then back at the board. "I need to report that my findings were not what was anticipated. Ms. Cooper's lab orders, the one cited as redundant, they were not errors. They were systematic documentation. Each test created a paper trail. A trail that connects directly to Dr. Whitfield's surgical codes. $2.3 million in fraudulent billing over 47 months. The charting you called careless? It's the evidence trail that proves the fraud. The room held silence for 10 full seconds. The kind of silence that happens when a narrative inverts completely and nobody knows which direction is up anymore. Then Marcus Chen appeared in his wheelchair, for pole rattling like wind chimes in a haunted house. He'd wheeled himself up from the ICU bed, against medical protocol, probably shouldn't have been able to move that fast, and he rolled directly to Ashley. When he looked up at her, his eyes were the eyes of a man seeing something he'd been missing his entire life click into focus. "She carried me 8 miles, Chen said." His voice was steady, young, full of a recognition that had been waiting 2 decades to be spoken aloud. "I was 4 years old. My parents were contractors. Mortar attack in Sanjin Valley. They didn't make it. She ran through gunfire to get me to the helicopter. Wouldn't leave me. Wouldn't evacuate herself until I was secure." He stopped. Swallowed. "My entire life, everything I became, everything I am, exists because she wouldn't put herself first. Wouldn't abandon a kid she'd just met. Wouldn't break her code." Ashley's jaw didn't clench. Her hands didn't shake. She was looking at Chen the way she'd looked at him the night he crashed, focused, present, already 3 moves ahead into what came next. This was the moment her naval intelligence handler had warned her about in those encrypted messages. The moment cover became irrelevant because the mission was complete. Chen was safe. The evidence was documented. The threat to classified operations had been contained. The board chairman stood. Then the vice chairman. The hospital administrator, who'd signed the termination paperwork that morning, pushed back from the table, and his face was the face of someone who'd just realized he'd been used as a tool in a con he didn't understand. Security arrived for minutes later. Not for Ashley. For Whitfield. The same guard he'd threatened to weaponize against her was the one who escorted him from the conference room, his hospital keycard already deactivated, his office being secured by federal investigators who'd arrived in black SUVs while everyone was still standing in shock. The investigator, working under a standing FBI directive once naval intelligence flagged the case, had brought his full documentation package. It took 3 boxes to carry it out. Whitfield's attorney called within an hour. His medical license suspension came through that afternoon, pending criminal investigation. The shell company dissolved into federal seizure. The board members who'd accepted kickback submitted resignation letters without being asked. One didn't even use a word processor, just printed a single sentence by hand and taped it to the conference room door, "I resign effective immediately." 2 weeks later, Whitfield's legal team negotiated with the U.S. Attorney's Office. 17 counts of Medicare fraud. Guilty pleas across all of them. House arrest instead of prison, a concession to his age and his cooperation, though cooperation amounted to little more than not fighting the inevitable. His attorney fees burned through his savings at a rate that would leave him financially hollow within months. 1 month later, Ashley attended the federal courthouse hearing in downtown San Diego, sitting in the back row where she could observe without being observed. Whitfield stood before the judge in a charcoal suit that hung on him wrong, a suit that belonged to a different version of himself, one that still had institutional power and social currency. He pleaded guilty in a voice so quiet the court reporter had to ask him to repeat his answers 3 times. The sentencing came through in 6 months. House arrest with electronic monitoring. Restitution to the federal government in an amount that would take him the rest of his life to repay. Loss of medical license permanently. A fall from grace that didn't even register as news outside of healthcare circles. There were always doctors committing fraud, always institutions protecting themselves right up until the moment they couldn't anymore. 6 months after that, a former colleague of Ashley's walked past a folding table in a strip mall parking lot in El Cajon, 15 miles from Seattle General Hospital. Whitfield was there, straightening stacks of supplemental insurance pamphlets, his hand shaking in that specific way that comes from understanding, finally, what it feels like to have no institutional protection. The colleague kept walking. Whitfield didn't even look up. 2 years after the code that changed everything, Ashley walked through Seattle General's renovated Veterans Care Unit, a new wing, built with federal funding, created specifically for her after she'd retired from active naval intelligence duty. Her title was Director of Veteran Services. Her office had a window that faced the San Diego Bay. On the shelf behind her desk, visible to anyone who entered, sat a pair of worn combat boots beside a framed photograph of 4-year-old Marcus Chen sleeping in a field hospital bed in Helmand Province, his small hand wrapped around a bottle of water, his chest rising and falling in the sleep of someone who'd finally found safety. Beside that photo was another one, Marcus Chen in dress uniform, Lieutenant Chen, his SEAL graduation ceremony, his eyes the eyes of a man who understood exactly what he was honoring when he wore those insignia. Jake was in his second year at the Naval Academy on a competitive appointment. The Medal of Freedom hung in Ashley's office now, in a display case of its own, alongside her 3 Navy Crosses. On Thursday mornings, she ran grand rounds with the hospital's trauma residents, teaching them battlefield triage adapted for civilian emergency medicine. The attending surgeon who'd frozen during Chen's code arrest, the one who'd watched Ashley's hands move with the precision of someone trained in the absolute worst circumstances, now asked her questions with genuine respect. Dr. Patel brought her coffee most mornings without being asked. The Marine security guard stood when she passed in the hallway, habit becoming ritual becoming respect. A young nurse approached her office one afternoon, fresh out of her residency, still new enough to the hospital that she didn't understand the full history of the woman behind the desk. "How did you stay calm?" the nurse asked. "When he was destroying you? When he was making those calls, writing those false reports, trying to end your career? How did you just keep working?" Ashley touched the combat boots on her shelf, then looked at the nurse directly. The voice that answered was different from the one the nurse had heard in the hallways, lower, steadier, carrying the weight of experience that can't be taught in any classroom. "True class is what you do when the lights go out," Ashley said. "He fought in conference rooms with lawyers and hospital politics. I fought in places where the only thing between someone living and dying was whether you could keep your hand steady for the next 72 hours. He never had a chance." The nurse nodded, understanding that she'd just received an answer that would take her years to fully comprehend. Outside the office window, the San Diego sun was setting over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson that looked like fire seen from a distance, beautiful because you were no longer in it. Somewhere in El Cajon, on a folding table outside a strip mall, Whitfield was straightening another stack of insurance pamphlets that no one would take. His hands were still shaking. They probably always would be. If you've made it this far, you know what real strength looks like. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need validation from a conference room. Subscribe for more stories about the quiet heroes who change everything in the places nobody's watching. Like this video. Tell us in the comments, would you have done the same thing in Ashley's position? Would you have stayed silent, or would you have burned it all down?